Good afternoon, welcome everyone. Okay, I see most people are online. Can you hear me? If you can you please drop a note in the chat? Perfect. All right. Welcome, my name is Charlotte Chideville. I'm the Regional Head of Operations for CIPD in the Middle East, joining you from Dubai, and I'll be your host today. Before we do start the session, I'll start with some housekeeping remarks. So this session is being recorded. You will be able to find a recording on our CIPD website and all social media channels afterwards. I know the team is quite responsive, so very soon thereafter. During the session, we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. We are focusing on giving you information today and hoping to give you a couple of takeaways and trigger some thinking around how you as organizations and leaders can respond to the crisis. But we would love to hear your thoughts and questions in the chat. So please do let us know if the session is being helpful, if you have any concern we haven't addressed yet in the chat or the Q&A box. We'll be checking both during the session. We'll be taking questions towards the end. This webinar is one of our rapid response initiatives. But to continuously support CIPD members and people professionals, we also have set up a Ukraine crisis hub, much like we have done during the Corona crisis. You can find it on our website, and I believe my colleagues will drop it in the chat box right down below right away. You'll find guides and support around topics from managing conflict at work to social responsibility, mental health, well-being, and much more. For CIPD members in the UK and in Ireland, you also have access to 2 of our hotlines. For legal support, call our HR Inform helpline, which is available 24/7. And of course, over the past 2 years, with the global events impacting every single one of us and our mental health and well-being, we've set up a well-being hotline. So CIPD in the UK and Ireland can access it. It's provided by us to CIPD members. It's free, available 24/7 and 365 days a year via the phone or through online consultations. If you need somebody to talk to, please do head out to them. And again, our team today will be dropping the details of this helplines in the chat. So today we're exploring the implications of the Ukraine crisis for employers and how people professionals and leaders can best support their people through this difficult time. Just as we were getting into a new normal 2 years into the pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine has definitely propelled us into a new uncertain, scary, and worrying reality. For the first-hand victims, of course, with over 2.8 million Ukrainians turned refugees overnight. For the people and residents of Russia being affected by severe economic sanctions, but not just. The tensions between the West and Russia and the economic sanctions are having a very far-reaching impact on our societies, economics, leaders, and workplaces. We'll have friends, family, colleagues typically affected by the crisis, from worrying about direct family members to being overwhelmed by the news, which is contributing to a worsening global mental health crisis that has started with the pandemic as well. Economically, the impact of sanctions will bite UK and EU nations, with businesses that are already suffering the surging inflation, disrupted supply chains that, like we are starting to see in the car industry, oil and gas, and F&B, which could definitely have an impact on the macroeconomic outlook. This is very uncertain. We will not be giving you predictions, but we as businesses and organizations can expect a direct impact on our workforces, even from a strategic workforce planning standpoint, having to resort to layoffs or certain measures. Today, we'll be taking a focused look on social responsibility, vulnerable leadership, compassion, mental health, conflict at work, all of these issues having resurfaced with the crisis. We're looking specifically at how you, employers and leaders, can tackle them. We're hoping to, again, give you some thinking, try and draw from the lessons of the pandemic and previous crisis into how we can take them forward, and hopefully hopefully support you through this in a small way. My panelists today are Peter Cheese, our Global Chief Executive at the CIPD, who will talk a little bit about responsible business and human leadership. Rachel Stuff, our Senior Employee Relations Advisor at the CIPD, will focus on mental health and well-being. Tony James, CEO of Oyster, which is a global employment platform that manages HR for companies with international employees, who will be talking about how they, as an employer, are responding to the crisis and giving us a couple of ideas on how we could do it. And finally, Louise Haycott, last but not least, who's a partner at Fragomen, and give us insights from an immigration standpoint. I'll let each of them talk and share a few viewpoints in the hope of, again, triggering some thoughts and getting us all to think and reflect on how we can best respond. And later on, we'll try and get into a discussion, picking on some of your live questions, so please do drop them throughout the chat. Thank you again for joining us. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and lovely to have you all again with us on one of these webinars. It's incredible. As Charlotte said, I mean, we responded hard to the pandemic. It hit organizations everywhere, of course, and we had to adapt very rapidly. And the HR profession, I think, became very front and center, so much of the organizational response. And as Charlotte said, we worked hard as the CIPD to support you. And yet here we are again. Yeah, we've come through one big crisis, and we're now into another one of a very different nature. And again, it's about a lot about our people, about how we sustain and support them, but of course, many other aspects of the response, which I'll touch on in a minute. But it is extraordinary, isn't it, to think about crises, and you can think of them in different ways. Of course, they represent a real challenge to us, and they always do, but they also represent points of learning and stimulus for change. And there's a lot going on around us. I've talked for many years about all the big changes that are happening in the world of work, all the political and economic and social and technological drivers of change. And then the crises come along and they accelerate so much of that change. And indeed, if you go back to Darwinian evolution, it's the same in evolution in all forms. I mean, steady change, but then along come crisis, big existential stimulus for change. So whilst this is hard again in terms of how we have to respond and all the operational tactical things we have to think about, it's also an opportunity again to learn. And the big things that I think, as Charlotte touched on, that we're having to respond to in this particular crisis range from, of course, many of you with businesses with perhaps operations and employees in Russia and in the Ukraine, and how you sustain and support them. The big debates for many businesses where you have live operations in Russia, and what you do you shut them down, pull away from them, but all of legal constraints behind that, and even concerns, as I've talked to many businesses about this, of saying, well, if I shut my operations in Russia, the Russians may just take it over. So there are many, many of those sorts of issues as well. Supply chain issues, and of course, these big geopolitical shifts cause us to rethink many assumptions that we've had before. And supply chain is a very good example, just as much as this movement of labor. And it's incredible, again, to think back since the end of the Cold War. A lot of people then were even talking about, this phrase of the end of history, that all of a sudden we've moved into this world of liberal democracy, everybody more or less in the same place, globalization, opening everything up, no barriers to movement of goods, labor, and services. And yet steadily, not just the Ukraine crisis, that world has seemed to be changing. Brexit and the Trump era in America were also causing us to sort of rethink some of the geopolitics, and therefore our assumptions about things like supply chains and who we're really dependent on and who we can really trust, and even the reshoring of operations as a result of these things. And I know that Louise is going to talk about some of the immigration challenges and indeed what this crisis sort of adds to that. But we've got other things. How do we respond to sanctions? And and indeed, as we've talked about within the CIPD, things like cybersecurity. Now that has been an issue for a while, but oh my goodness, when you see a crisis kick off, and I'm not just saying it's all coming from one place, incidentally, Russia. It's interesting, the cyber hackers are very smart, and they pick up on any big news item, and they will hide things behind those news items by saying, click on this, here's an update on what's going on in Ukraine, and then before you know it, you've exposed your organization. So even things like cybersecurity we're having to think about. But of course, what we've learned through many of these crises, and there was some great work we did during the course of the pandemic on trust. is that one of the things that becomes absolutely essential in an organizational response is trust. We have to learn to trust each other. People have got to trust leadership, we've got to be able to trust our employees as well. And we know through the previous crisis, through the pandemic, the organizations that seem to respond best and fastest, you could absolutely say, yes, they had trust embedded in how they work. They engaged with their employees. They talked openly about the things that they knew and the things that they didn't. And they engaged, as I said, their people in that overall response. Because what emerges also so much as part of these crises is all this uncertainty. And then recognition of leaders, that the world of leadership that so often was part of the past, and indeed I still see too much of it, the sort of command and control. I'm the leader, so I know what's going on, so I will just tell you. That world is long gone, and we're never going to create agile and responsive organizations if we don't engage with all of our people. But I'll tell you a rather amusing anecdote that I heard yesterday from one of my directors. One of his members of staff said to him, okay, so what have we done in this situation before? And you think, what do you mean, what have we done in this situation before? We haven't been here before. So it's interesting also, of course, you can get people in your organization who are looking to us and say, well, give me all the certainty. What are all the rules and policies I've got to abide by now? And the answer is we have to be honest. We're going to say, well, we're working it through and we need to engage with you to understand those things as well. And of course, another very critical part of engaging with our people, and Rachel will talk more about this, is absolutely understanding their well-being. There's no doubt that crises and uncertainty create a lot of stress. And we all deal with that in different ways, but it does. It creates lots of uncertainty. People will worry about everything from the future of their organization, their jobs, to perhaps they have relations and connections into the Ukraine and into Russia. And what does that mean for me? So well-being comes again very much to the fore in that sense of building connection to our people, engaging with them effectively, and helping again, as I said, to really engender that idea of trust. So these, as I said, are unquestionably challenging times. It's just remarkable to think, as you said, Charlotte, we came out of one big pandemic, with big crisis around the pandemic. We're all sort of learning how to adapt and what we've learned from that, and hybrid working, and actually some really exciting things now. And then we're faced with this, and it feels like, I think overall, when you look at the sort of geopolitics, as I said, not only is it not the end of history and we're all in liberal democracies again, this is setting the clock back in so many ways, and therefore the retrenchment of organizations and countries and national national sort of supply chains, the retrenchment back from these more globalized models is extraordinary. It's happening very, very quickly. So as I said, lots to think about, and I'm just delighted to that we have on the panel today James and Louise and Rachel to share in a bit more detail on some of those thoughts, and I look forward to contributing to some of the further discussion. So back to you, Rachel. Back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Peter. So much to unpack, and this is just a 1 hour session, so we'll try and stay focused. But if there is anything you want us to come back to later in the session, please do let us know through the chat. So you've given us you've focused, Peter, partly on the well-being and mental health impact of this crisis, which has come into sharp focus already throughout the pandemic, where organizations have admittedly made progress, yet so much remains to be done. Rachel, I'd like to call on you to give us a couple of thoughts around how this crisis is affecting mental health. What can organizations do to support employees in general, those who might just be watching the news and feeling overwhelmed, and in particular, our Russian and Ukrainian employees who are directly affected by the crisis and having to perform a job?
Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, as Peter said, I think he's given us a glimpse of the huge, complex issues for many organisations they're facing with the conflict in Ukraine. But as well, I think as organisations, as Peter also said, the starting point has to be encouraging understanding and considering people's well-being. And of course, that means considering ways to support any Ukrainian or other Eastern European nationals that you might employ or who have family over there at the moment, who could be based here or could still be working in Ukraine or close by in a neighbouring country. And also, if we have people from Russia as well, will be affected too. but also support for employees from any nationality who feel affected by what's happening at the moment. Because even if people don't have direct ties in terms of nationality, family to Ukraine at the moment, on a broader level, many of us will be feeling deeply affected by the shocking images that we're seeing, by the distressing human stories that we're hearing. And of course, as Peter said, the timing of this crisis comes on top of 2 years of the pandemic, where many people will already be feeling they're living in an uncertain world. This is another overwhelming event to cope with, over which they have no control, and it can feel very destabilizing in terms of our well-being. And of course, that doesn't stop when we go into work or when we switch on our laptop to work from home. Our feelings go with us. And the backdrop of this is people's mental health and how we're coming through the pandemic as it is. We've just had some findings back at the CIPD from research of the UK workforce. Almost 1 in 5 in the workplace describe their mental health as poor or very poor at the moment. Of course, not all of those have a diagnosed mental health condition. Our mental health fluctuates, but we do need to be mindful that some people will be particularly affected by the events that we're seeing unfold on our TVs. And especially, for example, if you've got a mental health condition already, it can be very triggering. So without singling out people or being judgmental, do try and identify people who might need help. It's important to send out those organisation-wide messages as well, offering the support that you've got available. Be very proactive. If you've got an employee assistance programme, employee networks, opportunities to come together and so on. Because if we didn't fully appreciate it before the pandemic, it has taught us how crucial communication is with people during a crisis. It's even more important when there are challenging issues and people want to discuss those. So we need to acknowledge that they're happening, provide opportunities for people to share their thoughts, discuss, reflect, and so on. It can be very hard to make sense of what's happening on a daily basis at the moment. And at the heart of that is fostering caring cultures where compassion really prioritises people's well-being. Compassion isn't fluffy. It's about kindness and empathy, but it's about action as well. So it's about thinking about what action you can take as an organisation and line managers as well. And that might be on a small level, offering flexibility and so on. But some people, especially if they're directly affected, if they are of Ukraine or Eastern European nationality and so on, they could be needing time off at short notice, for example, to try and check on the safety of loved ones and so on, to track people down. They could need paid special leave, for example. It really will depend on people's circumstances at the moment. But compassionate leave, even bereavement leave as well. Think of the different scenarios and the different groups of people who might be affected in your workforce. In terms of wellbeing as well, we can't overestimate the importance of self-care at the moment. We should be doing this anyway, but I think this crisis highlights that again, having that healthy routine. And I'd start with the news. It's on a 24/7 loop. There's social media as well. We want to be informed, but there's a balance because it can feel very overwhelming. We knew this during the pandemic as well. So do encourage people to step away, take a break, get outside if you can. And line managers, we have to talk about line managers. There is so much responsibility on them. There has been right throughout, even before the pandemic. They can be the only link that some people have got with the organisation in terms of accessing the support that's there. They're like a gateway in that sense. And they also hopefully have that one-to-one relationship where you can have that more personalised support, where your manager will say, how are you? I've noticed this or I've noticed that, how are you feeling and so on. And they, of course, will be affected as well, possibly directly or otherwise in terms of their well-being. It isn't a sign of weakness to access support, so they need to know that and the boundaries of their role in terms of supporting well-being as well. I think we've got to talk about inclusion, really important at this time. The pandemic, of course, had a very unequal impact on different groups and individuals. And whenever there's a crisis, and the same is true now, I think, with what's happening in Ukraine, we can have great potential for unity, but also divisiveness. And that's especially true as well, where there's emotions that could be running high, understandably, when people feel personally affected by what's happening. So HR, it is HR's responsibility, managers as well, to spot any tension, if there's any hostility, even bullying and harassment. People could have quite different views based on their own circumstances and nationality in terms of what's happening at the moment. And of course, we've got to remember that this is a war that's led by politicians, not by people, ordinary people. So we do need to foster that tolerance, acceptance, respect, openness, sharing, all those things, so important. Then final theme really is I want to talk about the importance of coming together as a community. Great to see you all here today. As distressing as the events are that are unfolding, it's important, I think, to focus on the amazing inspirational examples of humanity, compassion, courage, giving that we're also seeing unfolding. People are going out of their way to help. And there's a lot of people in our workplaces in the UK as well, and outside the UK, that also want to help wherever you might be in the world. And it's really beneficial for organisations to channel that as much as possible. Apart from the real humanitarian need, we know that acts of kindness, giving, have as much impact on ourselves as the givers as those on the receiving end. So think about the practical ways that people might want to help. That could be fundraising, giving to some of the emergency charitable appeals that have been set up by charities. I know my husband's organisation is matching every pound that employees raise or donate. That's one way. There's also the new government scheme launching for applications tomorrow, Homes for Ukraine. That's an amazing response to open up your family in that way, but it's a big commitment. It's a minimum 6-month commitment. There'll be an infrastructure of support around that, but these are displaced people fleeing from a war. Many will be traumatized. They're going to have economic needs, emotional, psychological needs as well. So the responsibility is significant. And what's the role of employer here? Can you support people who want to be a host? Is there any flexibility or type of leave that you can give? Back as I end on the role of HR, because you've been at the heart in organisations in responding to the pandemic. You've shown leadership, as Peter said, in a crisis, and the same is called for now. When people see chaos and suffering on the scale that we're seeing now unfold in Ukraine, you can feel vulnerable. You need leadership, you need reassurance, you need continuity and that steady influence. And cultivating the workplace as a community as well is really important as part of that. We had a briefing last week. We have them regularly. Peter spoke. He talked about Ukraine, and it was a safe place to share. So opportunities for that are really important, especially with people working from home. The power of peer support for our well-being is really important. And so looking for opportunities like that. And we've got our own online HR community at the CIPD as well. And that's an opportunity to come together as a profession. And there are lots of resources, as Charlotte has already mentioned, and I think our colleagues are putting in the chat. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. A lot to unpack here, so I'd like to bring in Tony and Peter, if you're still here. Otherwise, Tony. So we'll get back to mental health and wellbeing in a bit, because that's one of the aspects that you, Tony, as a CEO, highlight and have mentioned to me in offline. But I want to pick up on your last point first, Rachel. You're talking about responsible business and the importance of leadership. And so as we're talking to HR leaders, I've got 2 CEOs in the room today. In your experience, Tony, what role can leadership play in first of all, driving mental health? What have you decided to do? And then I'd love to hear your thoughts on responsible business. That's driven from the top, right? And that's tough decisions to make to keep business and yet ensure continuity.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there's a leadership need to be reinvented. In the last couple of years have shown us that actually that's essential in ensuring a thriving workplaces. First is really recognizing as leaders that the the mental health and well-being of our employees is at the center of our business. I call it the golden triangle of growth. So not only you want to manage growth in the business, but also you want to manage customer satisfaction and your employee well-being and engagement. So you add that as a variable in the way you run your business. And concretely, what we're doing at Oyster is our goal is to demonstrate that distributed work, because we are a distributed work platform, is better for business and better for people. And we focus on creating an inclusive environment. We are a highly diverse environment, and more importantly, a safe environment where people can be themselves, especially coming from 60 countries. So we have an amazing diversity in the business, and it's important we create that safety so everybody can feel safe being here. And also you need to measure that. So we have applications in the business that enable us on a daily basis to get a pulse about how people are feeling in the business. And I can tell you, since the war started in Ukraine, we got a dip in that. So as Rachel was mentioning, this is not only about, like everybody is affected by this, right? It's not only about the people in the region. Obviously, I can tell you about our specific response to our employees affected in the region, but everybody is affected. And we've seen a dip in how people are feeling across the company in all these 65 countries that we operate in.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony. Peter, thoughts around we're hearing psychological safety, responsible business. Any lessons, in addition to response, any lessons, things that we've learned from COVID in your experience that would be helpful in this time of crisis?
A couple of thoughts. I mean, the first is visibility of leadership, right? I mean, there's no doubt, and I'm sure Tony experienced the same thing I certainly did, as the crisis hit, people are looking to the leader. Now, we don't have all the answers, as I said, but they are looking to the leader. How are we responding? How are we thinking? What's on your mind? So we need to be visible. And the great thing that we learned through the pandemic is I think leaders did step up in their way. They were much more visible. I know I spent more time with the organization, talking to the organization. We were weekly communicating with either online calls or video updates, all these sorts of things. So I think that's number one. Number two, I would say, sort of building on Tony's thoughts about principles. So be clear on your principles, what you believe in. And even though times are really hard and we're in a time of crisis, we're going to stick true to those principles. So things like engagement with people, well-being, we've already touched on, creating these safe cultures, because it is very easy in times of crisis for leaders to say, oh my goodness, that's all very interesting, but I've got a real problem to solve over here. And you get driven down these very operational things. And I mentioned that point of trust, and trust is built from seeing leaders being consistent in their behaviors and beliefs around principles, even though many other things are changing around them. And yes, absolutely, to reinforce what's been said about safe cultures. Safe cultures start from the top, and they start from us as leaders being open ourselves about what we don't know, what we do know, what we're vulnerable about, what our concerns are, what our worries are. And then that gives permission to so many others to speak as well, safely and openly. And that's, of course, leadership all the way down through the organization.
May I add something to what Peter is saying, is that what does that human-centric leadership look like for me? And for me, it is at the minimum is do no harm. What I mean by that is, like, we have so much pain and anxiety in our life outside of work. We come to work, and then these get amplified. Our insecurity get triggered. So how, as leaders, we make sure that the work, the environment we create for our organization doesn't trigger these insecurities and these fears. And that's at the minimum. This is where we start. And that's actually already a huge challenge to be aware how to create an environment that make people not feel additional anxiety and additional pain and stress being at work. And if we achieve that, which is, for me, it's a huge challenge, this is where we achieve human-centric leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been doing so many of these webinars and so many diverse topics. And the one thing that keeps coming back is that human-centric leadership, is that trust, it's culture. It lays the foundation to all the behaviors you're talking about, those that are recognized and rewarded, and those that are frowned upon that we do not tolerate. I have a question came into the chat. So inclusion came back to the top of organizations' agenda throughout the pandemic, with unfortunately minority employees and female employees being hit harder. We are seeing it yet again in a very different way. This crisis shedding a light on inequalities. And I got somebody in the chat right now talking about how this crisis is disproportionately affecting people from an immigration background who are just feeling uneat ease, seeing how comparing their experience to the treatment of refugees in Ukraine. Injustice is always difficult to tolerate. Inclusion is a constant act. What do you see that you can do as organizations to maintain this harmony? And I know, Tony, that's one thing that is perhaps closer to your heart as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Charlotte. Like I was born in Lebanon in 1980. I spent the first 10 years of my life in a civil war. My village got shelling from Syrian tanks for 10 years. Okay, and nobody was there to help me escape. All right. However, I have to say that we have to look at this as a positive message to the world, because what we want is that the next refugee crisis and the next war, the world has learned about this is not okay, and I'm very optimistic about how the world is going to react in a more human way for the next conflict that we're going to have in the future. Okay, that's the message I want to take here. However, if your organization have employees in other affected regions where there is a refugee crisis, we talked about the Middle East is one of them, but it's not only restricted to the Middle East. You have to be culturally sensitive to that, and you have to start thinking about how can you create a refugee response that is global, not necessarily to the conflict that is happening now in front of our eyes. And to give you an example, in our case at Oyster, we had few employees in Lebanon, and we know what's happening in Lebanon. It's a collapsed country. There's no electricity, no water, no safety, 20x devaluation of the currency. We had to get our employees out of the country and give them a refugee status in Cyprus. That the government was very, very happy to help us do that. So you need to think about how you can create equality in your response to this refugee crisis.
Yeah, and I'd quickly add, Charlotte, and I absolutely agree with everything you said, Tony, and really interesting to hear about your own personal experience, which is something I'm sure you share with the organization as well. That's about your sort of authenticity. But yeah, we touched on it a little bit before, Charlotte, about this idea that, okay, we focus a lot on the refugees, the Ukrainians, but we have Russian employees as well. And it's not their fault that this is happening. And we've got to be very careful. The inclusion thing means that we respect everybody, and that we need to make sure we're not creating a culture in our organization which then starts to discriminate against people because they happen to be Russian. And indeed, as we know, we got Russian employees ourselves, they are deeply concerned about that themselves. And we've got to make sure that this is safe environments for them as well in our organization.
Absolutely. Before we get into your response as an employer, Tony, because it's very related to this, really, how do you take these leadership lessons and turn them into actions for employers? I was interested to hear from you, Rachel, in terms of back to you, Rachel, in terms of fostering that inclusion, and what Peter touched upon right now is the risk of conflict. Right, we are seeing conflict at work. We are seeing people on the edge as well with mental health crisis. Would you have 2-3 things that people professionals could focus on to try and manage the situation as best as can be, and provide that psychological safety and support to line managers we were mentioning before?
Yeah, it's a really important area at the moment, Charlotte. And I think, when we talk about psychological safety, we should try and unpick that a little bit. And I think it's just, at a sort of basic human level, it's about creating those working relationships and that culture in an organization where the culture is respectful. People are kind, they're fair and consistent. And yes, leaders do play a massive role in creating that. But it's where managers as well, I think, have a really important role to play. So I've mentioned the really important role of line managers already. But if you think about the situation managers are in, and they will have a defining influence on how safe people feel to talk up, share concerns, and so on, and be really honest about how they feel and so on, then managers are really managing at the moment really potentially quite complex situations in their teams. And we talked about, I saw a message in the chat from somebody who said that calls to the Samaritans have got around 50% around concern for the situation that's happening there at the moment. And really it is line managers who are in the so-called kind of immediate front line in terms of how employees are feeling. So I think really for HR, top priority should be to communicate, guide line managers around what their response to this situation is at the moment and how they can help create that inclusive culture.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, all this sounds great and it's great lessons and it's clear. It's so much harder to put into action and even harder to do it consistently. We've seen a lot of organizations do well during crisis and then almost forget about the lessons of the crisis and try and go back to business as usual. And then we're constantly playing this play and pause situation. So Tony, how did you translate that vision into action? Can you tell us a little bit about how you responded as an organization, in a couple of points?
Yeah, so I think Oyster is a special organization because not only we have our own employees in the region, but we have the employees of our customers, and we have a bit less than 100 team members distributed across Ukraine and Russia. The war broke, and my message to them is it's time to show more humanity when humanity is tested. And here are a number of things that we've been doing since then and sharing with the wider HR community. Number one is offer emotional support and work flexibility. That's important that we remind these people that we believe that their safety comes first, and that's the most important thing, and they should put that ahead of work. Secondly is really helping them with relocation to a safe place and help them regain stability. So we offered relocation support, help with moving to a safe country, opening bank account, arranging accommodation. Third is really about realizing that this is going to have a long-term impact. This is more than just safety. Think about their friends and family they will worry about. Think about survival guilt, PTSD. Everybody is going to, even not in the conflict itself, we're all seeing these images and we're suffering from some form of PTSD. And then I want to say about come up with payment strategy ahead of time. We know payments it's going to get tricky in some of these affected regions. At Oyster, we were able to build a payment crisis team because we're running a human critical service, which is payroll, and offer advanced payment specifically for people that are trying to move to a new country where they're going to have additional expenses in that time. I want to also add, we give employee access to therapy, not only our Ukrainian employees, but also all of our employees at Oyster. We have a service that we use. We put at their disposal therapy support. And as I mentioned earlier, we've seen a drop in mental health in our company through this tool that we use, that we measure the sentiment of people on a daily basis. Two more points I want to say. You want to work with managers because usually people will not going to come to HR or to the CEO first. They want to go and talk to their manager. So you want to have a briefing on the manager on a regular basis to make sure that they are ready to inform and support their teams on the ground. And finally, what we're doing at Oyster, we are waiving all fees for companies to hire Ukrainian refugees, so that we enable them to continue to have professional activity after they get to safety, and we're also donating funds to the local humanitarian organizations.
Are you hiring, Tony? Because I think you'll get a lot of applications.
Absolutely. I mean, we are getting 12,000 job application a month for a company that is 2 years old. Is like we're up chart on that perspective.
I think that's, I mean, great example of a holistic approach to caring about employees and to responsible business. I mean, you've covered kind of the big four: relocation support, that's logistics, that's psychological safety, payment, that's financial safety, important to us all, and not just in times of that crisis. We've seen other situations where it can get difficult. Therapy, I mean, mental health and well-being is critical, and responsible business beyond your employees. I love that one, and that's one for perhaps a different discussion. But being a responsible business is not just about the people that you're managing. It may be about the people that you're impacting further down the line in your supply chain, your partners, your clients. So thank you for sharing that. I hope that gives practical ideas of how we can touch different areas. I wanted to pick up on a question from the chat that we've received around business continuity. So we're talking about responsible business. We're seeing a lot of organizations doing that, and rightly so. It's important for employer branding and whatnot. But it's having an impact on the business, right? Pulling out of Russia for so many organizations is having a huge toll on the business. How do you ensure business continuity? We're already seeing questions in the chat around protecting jobs or thinking of ways in which we can continue paying people or give them support in a time where we may not get the raw materials and be able to produce anymore, and where we may have to lay off a workforce. Thoughts on that, Peter, and then we'll pick up on the immigration aspect, hugely important.
Very challenging, and I saw Maureen's question. What I'm seeing most businesses doing at the moment around some of these continuity questions is taking a sort of short-term time frame, because we just don't know how long this is going to go on. So the first thing is trying to protect your employees, whether in Ukraine or Russia. And if you're having to shut your business in Russia, then many businesses trying to keep some form of payment coming through to the Russian employees. We're all acknowledging it's very, very tough, and there are huge challenges in the Russian economy as well because of sanctions. So I think responsible employers are trying to say, look, they are employees. It's not their fault what's going on. And if we're going to reopen our business at some point in Russia, we've got to do what we can to look after them. So even if they're just saying, look, for the next 3 months, we will sustain payments through to you, and then we'll see what happens. They're at least signaling right from the very beginning that we understand these things. We need to look after our employees wherever they are. And of course, other effects, like if we're having to support movement of Ukrainian staff from Ukraine to safe places, again, we'll sustain that perhaps for a period of time, and then we'll see what emerges. So it just speaks again to this idea of agility and responding to these really important principles. Wherever people are, we want to try to protect them and look after them. But we know this is a very fast evolving situation, so we're going to have to keep coming back to these questions in the coming weeks.
Absolutely. And again, back to what you were saying earlier, although the situation is entirely new and unknown and unexpected in many ways for many of us, a lot of the impact that's being felt isn't new. During the pandemic, we had entire industries not being able to function because we didn't have people getting to work. We weren't able to import. So context was different, but the impact was similar on the workforce. And so, of course, we're not giving answers here, and it's still early into the crisis. But do you think, Peter, that some of what we've learned around maintaining, reskilling, upskilling our workforces could come in handy right now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As you said, we during the pandemic, we were in somewhat parallel situations of having, perhaps to let go people, or certainly furlough them. What's different, of course, is we don't have the financial support that we had during the pandemic. So many organisations, as I said, saying, look, we know we could sustain this for 3 months or so, and then we're going to have to review where we are. Because the governments aren't stepping in to say, right, well, I'm really sorry you've had to close down your operations, but in Russia, but here's some furlough payments to see you through. So yes, there are things that we can learn, but it's also understanding there's some different things as well. And I'm sure Louise will have some thoughts on that as she gets into her session.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, so you gave me a great segue, Tony, by covering all different areas that you did. So, Tony, you were mentioning relocation support that you offered to your teams during this crisis, and not just. You're mentioning how you've helped Lebanese employees move into Cyprus, how you've partnered with governments. For those employees that have tried to support, it sounds easier than it may actually be. So Louise, would you give us maybe some context around the immigration situation right now, what it means for employers, and then we've got quite a few questions around immigration on the topic. Thank you for being here, Louise. Louise is from Fragomen.
Oh, thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. It's been really fascinating discussion. And I couldn't agree more about the importance of the visibility of leadership, about engaging with your people, and about thinking in terms of the support that you're offering, who it is that you are offering it to, what support you can give. Is it your people? Is it your people's people? And I think we've all learned an awful lot through the pandemic, as we've discussed before. And whilst we haven't been here before, we can employ some of those strategies again. And like you say, it is very important to understand the context of what we are dealing with and who we might be talking about. The people that have left Ukraine have done so having travelled in a very dangerous situation. Men aged 18 to 60, of course, can't leave. So those people are predominantly women, or they are elderly, or they are children. And that may guide us in terms of the immigration options that we might look for those people. So in terms of breaking down who it is that we are talking about, who it is that we can offer that practical assistance to, it could be the Ukrainians who are still in the Ukraine and what they can do to get out. It could be Ukrainians who have left and need an onwards destination to somewhere that they can be safe. They could establish themselves for a period of time. And like we said before, we don't know how long this is going to go on for, but ideally they would have options in terms of social welfare. They would have options in terms of being able to work if they wanted to, be that for your organization or indeed for somebody else. And then lastly, of course, finishing off on Russians. And we've said before, Rachel put it very, very well, that this is a situation caused by a Russian regime, not by Russian individuals. And equally, they do need our support in this scenario. If I could also just make one other point, of course, is that COVID hasn't gone away. And particularly for Russian nationals, we do need to remember that there may be requirements for them as they try and enter other countries, particularly as the Sputnik vaccine isn't recognized by very many countries. So just an extra angle to think about if you are looking at offering the relocation support that Tony was discussing. Now, we'll talk first about Ukrainians in Ukraine, clearly the most compelling. They can only now travel by land to a neighbouring country, the majority into Poland, then Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Moldova. Of course, they will have been through a dangerous and long journey, and I'm sure that the wellbeing support that Rachel discussed would be of phenomenal benefit to them. Now, Ukrainians can enter the Schengen area without a visa. They can go into those bordering countries. Now, usually they would need, of course, a biometric passport. Actually, what we're seeing is there's lots of concessions for Ukrainian nationals. They simply need to be able to prove their identity. So, for example, a child that doesn't have a passport could produce a birth certificate. We're seeing a real will of those nations to ensure that they are creating that safe passage for individuals into those countries. For those individuals that have left, obviously then they need somewhere to go. Now there's many jurisdictions that are offering lots and lots of concessions, lots and lots of humanitarian help. But because of geography, I'll just focus on the EU and the UK for today. So the European Union has invoked the Temporary Protection Directive. Now what that does is it deals with the mass arrival of Ukrainian nationals and their family members, or those that were covered by humanitarian protection. And they needed to have been residing in the Ukraine before the 24th of February. Now, when they go into a European Union country, they would be able to apply for protection under this directive. They would get a 1-year protection that would run from the 4th of March 2022. So everybody's would be finishing on the 4th of March 2023, but that is extendable, firstly in 6-month increments, and then the European Union could extend it by a third year. Now, with that, individuals would be able to work, they'd have access to social welfare, and each member state is going to implement that on a member state basis. So we're seeing at the moment lots of countries announcing what that process is going to look like. So really, for those individuals that are fleeing this conflict, the European Union is providing a really good protection for them, and something that means that they can feel safe and that they can feel protected for a significant period of time. Now, for the UK, the arrangements are slightly different. A Ukrainian would need a visa to enter the UK, and there has been a lot of press about whether or not that should be removed. There are a number of concessions and new categories that have been announced. Firstly, if you are already in the UK as a visitor and you're Ukrainian, you can switch into any of the usual categories. So you could be a family member, you could switch into work permission, for example, without needing to go anywhere else. So the usual routes are still open as well for Ukrainian nationals. You can apply in any country that you would want to. You no longer need to have a TB test, but you would need English language unless you are applying under the intra-company transfer regime. But more importantly, there are 2 new schemes that are specifically dedicated to this scenario. And I think what's interesting with both the EU and the UK arrangements is they've been very quick to get new categories up and running to make sure individuals aren't pushed down a standard normal asylum route, which is very clogged up already and may not allow individuals to access the same benefits as some of these newer protections, which would allow work, which would allow access to benefits, etc. So the 2 schemes that I wanted to highlight, first is the Ukraine Family Scheme. Now, this would mean that anybody who is British or holds permanent residence, holds a humanitarian protection, or holds a status under the EU Settlement Scheme, which was the permission that individuals who were European residing pre-Brexit would have got, can bring their Ukrainian extended family members. So that would include parents, it would include aunties, it would include in-laws, it would include cousins, plus their family members to the UK for a 3-year period. They're able to work, they're able to study, they're able to access benefits. Now, that application can now be processed online, provided an individual has a biometric passport. To date, there have been 25,000 applications, with 6,100 were issued by 4 p.m. yesterday. Within that, there is some discretion about the types of family members that could apply, the documents that you might need. I can see that it must be very difficult for people that have fled a conflict to be able to provide birth certificates for siblings or grandparents or whoever it might be. So do look at practical solutions to solving what that might look like. And the second scheme, which has already been mentioned, is Homes for Ukraine. And we've seen this overwhelming outpouring of people willing to offer accommodation that they have, either that they already have access to, or that a room in their home. It's for sponsors to offer accommodation to Ukrainian nationals who are fleeing the conflict, who lived there before the 1st of January 2022. They need to offer that room for a 6-month period. And again, there will be a 3-year permission that will be issued to these individuals. Now, the scheme hasn't opened yet. It doesn't open until tomorrow, but both organisations and individuals can sign up to show their interest. One of the complications about it is that individuals are going to have to match themselves to a Ukrainian national. It's going to be in 2 phases. Tomorrow that goes live is for individuals who are going to sponsor a Ukrainian. You may have heard me say with the family scheme, it was only for certain statuses within the UK. This would allow, for example, a skilled worker to sponsor their family members to come to the UK. Phase 2, and we don't have a go live date for this yet, will be for organisations, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people in the call that are particularly interested in that, and perhaps we could have another chat at that point. But yeah, the scheme will go live tomorrow for individuals. And then lastly, just to touch very briefly on Russians, obviously the concessions that I've just mentioned don't apply to them. It may be that those individuals wish to leave very quickly. As a general rule of thumb, individuals would need to apply for a visa outward anywhere in a country where they have legal residency or a nationality, which means practically for most people, they need to apply for a visa from Russia. There are a few exceptions to that. For example, the CIS countries, Russians are visa exempt there, and they may also be work permit exempt. You would need to get further advice on that. But also there are good options, for example, into the UAE. Russians can arrive, get a visa on arrival, and they can switch into different worker statuses if work was the particular driver. And I think you've already mentioned, but it's definitely a point worth reiterating, that many of you will have Russian nationals within your organisation feeling incredibly upset about this scenario. And I know that Rachel has spoken already about the wellbeing support. There is also an element of practical support as well around the reassurance that as things stand, visas, if they have one, would be renewed. Maybe putting them in touch with somebody that can talk to them about that practical aspect that might also be causing a level of anxiety. And Charlotte, I'll pass back to you because I know that we're nearly at time.
Thank you, Louise. We're almost on the hour, so I'll let anybody who's got questions regarding immigration let us know right away. But I think as we're letting people kind of take in all this information, I still have the 5 of you right now. So I guess my perhaps I would like to come to each of you and ask you for perhaps final thoughts, or what would be your #1 recommendation for leaders and organizations in responding to this crisis, or anything you wish I had asked you, which I haven't yet. I'll start with you, Tony. Oh, Peter, I know you need to leave. I'll start with you, Peter. You're on mute.
Sorry, just very quickly, a really good discussion. I think we covered a lot of the issues. That I would go back to this point about being open and visible as leaders in times of crisis, and really sharing our beliefs and principles with the organization, a lot of which we've talked about. And I think that's something so many of us, as I said, learned through the last pandemic. And I think it's just as important that we keep that going now.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for joining us today. Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to hear Louise set out some of the possibilities for people from Ukraine to come here. And I think some employers are already showing a real interest in recruiting people from Ukraine as well. And so I think I'd finish on that point just to say that is an opportunity for employers as well at the moment, but also to really make sure that if you do recruit people into your organisation who have fled from the events there, that it's important to think about the wider support as well that you can offer for people who are coming essentially as refugees who are now able to work here. So do think about the wider support that you can offer to people in terms of their needs.
Thank you. Tony?
The events in the last 2 years are clear. The universe is asking leaders to show more human-centric leadership. And this is a time to do so. It's a time for leaders to change their leadership style and listen to what the world and the employees are asking them. So my recommendation to them is, this is your opportunity. Change what leadership is.
Thank you. Louise, back to you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I sort of reiterate all of the above, but to engage with people, to be able to provide the well-being and the practical support in one go, and check that those human-centric leaders have those right messages and that empathy to be able to deliver to their populations.
Thank you, Lewis, Tony, Peter, Rachel, for being so generous with your insights and this conversation. Well, hopefully we did give you a lot to think about, at the very least. A lot of critical moments for me, and a reminder that what we are often talking about human-centric leadership, but it is not a good to have anymore. It's proving to be a must-have. It's proving to be essential to business survival in times of crisis and beyond. So to remember that a lot of what we are doing right now can be taken into the future. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. The recording of this session will be made available online. And if you would like to connect with those speakers, I know Peter can be connected with on LinkedIn, at Twitter, he's very active. Tony, can people connect with you on LinkedIn?
Absolutely.
Perfect. I'm sure we'll see more of you again in the future. And Louis, thank you so much as always for chipping in. Our wellbeing hotlines are available to you. We'll share more links, recordings, and resources. Please do let you know what you thought. Share this on social media and let us know how we can best support you. The only way we can respond to your needs is by knowing your needs. So reach out to us. We're everywhere on social media and available on a phone call, by email. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great evening, afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming.